Hi.
Hi.
Yes. Hi, I'm Yvonne. I'm a storyteller myself. And I was wondering if you have like a personal rule, like when are you ready to tell a tough story?
Yeah, that is a tricky one. I would say two things about it. One is a lot of people are afraid they're going to cry when they're telling a story, especially if the story involves trauma or something. And I don't think there's anything wrong with crying. I mean, so many people have cried at the Moth. We've lost count, and it can be a very tender and honest thing. But when, like, say you write out a story or reading it to a friend, you find that you can't stop crying, that, it just brings up so much emotion that you struggle to get through it. You might not quite be ready. And one way to chip away at it is to think about, like, is there a way to tell a smaller story within the bigger story? Because another test we sort of have is can the person find a place to land the story, to end it? Like, you never want your story to be all wrapped up in a bow, but is there some conclusion you can draw? So maybe if, like, I'm just making this up off the cuff, but if, like, your story is about, like, the tough relationship you had with your father, and maybe that tough relationship goes on to this day, but is there some piece of it where sometime in the years, the two of you resolve some bit of it and tell a story about just that little bit? Because from there, you might find that you're able to expand. So, like, that's what I would suggest.
Any questions?
Hi. How do you decide who to tell a story to? I feel like the Moth, a lot of the time the stories are on stage and you're sharing them with an audience, but I feel like there's a difference between telling a story in a conversation versus on a stage.
Yeah.
And I've never quite made sense of, like, when you tell a story on a stage versus in a conversation.
Interesting. I would say that if you're going to tell a story on stage, you want to pick the moments in your life that have been, like, meant the most to you, because, like, we all have endless stories. And so, like, most people I know have, like, 2 or 3 things that they've experienced in life that just feel like the defining moments of their life. And they don't have to be huge moments. They could be small moments within that. But I would say start there, because the more important the story is to you, the more likely it's going to connect with other people.
Hi.
Hi.
Wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
People who are scared of public speaking,
Yeah.
what's the worst thing that could actually happen?
Okay. So one of the dark secrets of the Moth is that the artistic director for 20 years until, like, 29 days ago has great fear of public speaking. You might have noticed at the beginning. Although I will say, so 2 things. I will say that nerves mean you care. If you're not nervous, it probably means on some level, unless you're just like somebody who's like a constant stand-up all the time, that's their job, that if you're not, that nerves actually are a good thing. It shows respect for the audience, and just remember that, and that the nerves are there to just show you that you want to be here right now, actually. But I would also, here's the worst thing that can happen, because I've witnessed it. The worst thing that can happen, you would think the worst thing that could happen is you walk out on stage and you forget your story. I've seen this twice. I've been in the audience twice when this happened. One time, to shout him out, this brilliant writer, Mark Katz, he had told the story many times perfectly, and he just blanked in the middle of his story, and he actually ran off stage. And it was a little bit confusing. And I believe at the time, Jonathan Ames jumped up on stage and told another story. Some of you guys may remember Jonathan from back in the days. But ultimately, Mark pulled it together and came back out in the second half and began his story where he left off with the words, "So as I was saying." So brilliant, and he finished it. But usually what happens is if a storyteller blanks on stage, and I have seen dozens of times, the Moth audiences are just like you guys, like warm, and you can just feel that everybody wants you to do well. And so the audience will just, like, start applauding and be like, "You've got this." And the person might be stumbling for a second, but then they'll jump back in and get going again. And that's the thing I think that most people are afraid of. But for me, the worst thing that actually can happen on stage is not that. The worst thing that happened on stage is that somebody is there and they're so worried about hitting every word for word perfect that they become memorized and cut off from the audience. And they're standing on stage speaking, but their head is really picturing a sheet of paper that they've like left in their purse backstage. And they're failing to actually look out and connect with the audience. I mean, that is to me far worse than actually daring to open up your heart, getting up there, forgetting yourself, and then having to get yourself back together to keep going. Like, an audience would rather see you make an honest mistake and then get going again than to go up there and be so perfect and stiff that they don't know who you are as a human being.
Hello, I'm Taylor over here.
Hi. Okay.
Hi. I was wondering, sometimes I feel like as someone who does podcast interviews and talks about my work and my personal life and whatnot on those, I feel like sometimes there are stories that I'm nervous to tell because I feel like they're for me. Like, I'm almost like, oh, if I put this out in the world, it's then a story that I told for an audience versus just like, this was a moment that I really cherish or I really learned something hard. So I'm curious in how you kind of approach those. Yeah.
I hear that. I mean, I think you have to ultimately decide in these moments, like, is that story, does it better serve you artistically in your heart as something that is use the word treasure again, but like, a thing that like, by not sharing it, it's going to be your superpower. It's going to be something inside of you. Or will the act of sort of spinning out and sharing it with your audience ultimately give them a gift that then comes back to you in a different way? And then they're both equally valid, and you just have to choose for yourself.
Hi, I'm Chelsea. I'm also a fellow podcaster. My podcast is called My Non-Expert Opinion, and everyone wants to download and rate it 5 stars. Thank you so much. My question, I actually work with podcasters too, and it's about the balance between specifics and brevity.
Yeah.
Because specifics tend to make the story just a little longer, but long-form podcasts, they're already really long. So how do you find the balance of like, I want to be specific, but I also need to land this plane and like get to the point?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really excellent question, and it's tricky. I mean, I would say if you're telling a story, you want to look at what are the most important points, like what are you most trying to convey, and then you want to find scenes that represent those. So for the most important points, you want to deep dive in and give that detail so that the listener feels like they are right there in the room with you. But then if you're trying to go from point A to point B, like if you're skipping ahead in time, just let yourself skip ahead. And so I think the most really great stories have moments where you're going into a scene, but like, it's like we say sometimes if you're like baking a cake, you could just take the cake out of the oven. You don't have to have all the steps. But if the point is like this special recipe and how you're putting it together with your grandfather, then you might actually want to take us through all the steps. And so I think some combination makes it for the best stories. Not to be like our book, but we wrote a book called How to Tell a Story, and we have an entire chapter dedicated to just this. I'm not trying to be a book pusher up here, but yeah.
Okay, one more question. No pressure, but it's the last one.
Thank you. That was remarkable.
Thank you.
My question is, how much does delivery play in telling a good story? And kind of a part 2 to that question is, do people ever pitch stories of other people where they have a specific insight on something that happened to someone else, but not necessarily that person themselves?
Okay, so so for the first one, I would say delivery is amazing. Like if you're a Phyllis, who's just like a born raconteur, it's going to make it better. But I have seen again and again that it's the content of the story much more than how it's delivered that lands with people. And you can have someone who's an incredible storyteller who's up there, but if they're not really willing to reveal themselves or like go deep, those stories tend to not land as well as somebody who's maybe a little bit shy, but who's really willing to open up their heart and connect with the audience. So that was like the first question. And then the second one is, I will just say this from a moth perspective, is we generally encourage people to only tell their own stories. Like we joke that we want you to be very, very self-absorbed. That's not to say that you can tell a story about your relationship with your grandmother or your grandfather or someone that you love, but fundamentally, like the overall arc, like who you are at the beginning and who you are at the end, needs to be grounded in you, not in that other person's experience. But that is just at the Moth. There are so many storytelling platforms. So if you do want to tell somebody else's story, there's definitely places out there where you can do that. Okay. Thank you all. You've been so great.